Good morning, everybody. How are you doing? Good. I'm used to asking my students how they're doing, so I'm kind of like. My name is Krista McClune, and I teach library and technology for the Coxsackie Athens Central School District. And yes, I did have to learn to say Coxsackie properly because I was saying Coxsackie at first when I first started working there, and apparently that gives you away as an outsider. Um, I work at Edward J. Arthur. It is a small rural elementary school that teaches pre-K through fourth grade. I teach library skills and technology. So I have my students twice in a 6-day rotation. And then by term, I have certain grade levels for an extra period. So I'm actually quite lucky to get them in class very often. So I decided to focus my presentation on media literacy and specifically on aliens. I was a kid in the 90s who loved the X-Files. I noticed going into my job, I started on the 5th of December, 2022. I was replacing an outgoing librarian and really had to gain that trust from students, like going in and replacing somebody who they loved. They weren't certain of my place in the hierarchy. And I was learning what they did and didn't already know. One of the biggest mistakes I made when I started was reteaching them Destiny, how to look things up. And the shyest kid I teach was very exasperated and said, Miss Brooke already taught us this. And it made me freeze. And I'm like, oh boy. So I need to rethink how I'm doing this. So I started pre-assessing what they already knew and started with media literacy. I knew it was an emphasis that we were really focusing on at the district level. And I was like, let's figure out what they already know and what they might need to know, what their interest is. So I started with this question. What is media? And for those of you at home, feel free to hit the QR code, answer on the Padlet. If you would like to in the audience, you can, or if you want to raise your hand. First thing that comes to mind when you hear the word media, what is it to you? The news. Anybody else? Bueller? No, I'm kidding. So I wanted to share some of the answers I got from my students with you. And I'm going to give the Padlet a minute just in case some of you at home answer that question. These are the answers I got from my 3rd and 4th graders this year and last. Video games, Switch, music, phones, Snapchat, Sora and Epic for books read on my iPad because we are a one-to-one district. We're an Apple school. And each student, other than pre-K, goodness, has their own iPad that we do bring to class on tech days. So obviously the iPad was a hit. Podcasts, we're learning about that this year a little bit more, but some of the kids shared some of their favorites with me. Phones, Spotify. I even got a couple of suggestions for playlists from my students, which was excellent because their taste in music was very similar to mine. My mom's car books. I really appreciated that answer. And the student said, Ms. McClune, do you ever listen to car books? I'm like, absolutely. And they're like, hopefully you're not listening to John Grisham. And I'm like, you're listening to John Grisham? All right. Didn't say that, but I was thinking it. Movies, email, clever messages. We use a single sign-on system for some of our programs, and students can message each other and me. And boy, does that have great implications. And sometimes I have to say, oh, you can't be typing that to each other. Like, just remember, I can see it all. Car TVs was by far the most interesting one because I hadn't thought about that. I'm like, televisions in cars now. Okay. Like, yeah, don't you have one? I'm like, I can't watch a TV show while I'm driving to work. I don't think that would be a very good idea. And then my favorite one was the student who did this and said, what about your smartboard? And I'm like, that is a tool of media. Some students did say news. A couple of them said, news is kind of hard though, because you don't know what's fake and what isn't. And I'm like, I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole. So the next question I asked them, what is media literacy? Does anybody here want to tell me what comes to mind when media literacy comes into play? No wrong answers, folks. Anybody else? Thank you for that. All right, well, I wanted to share some of their answers with you because some of them were really interesting, and I did organize a few of them by size. I don't know was the biggest answer I got, and that's an acceptable answer to me. I would rather a student, when they're doing a post or pre-assessment, tell me they don't know, because that is going to tell me exactly where to start. So I don't know was the most common answer I got last year and this year. I know, but I can't tell in words was a pretty common one too. Something that they were familiar with, but couldn't explain in writing, or even like if I came and said, can you explain it to me in words? They're like, well, no. And I'm like, then write that down. Say you know it, but you can't tell me. This question makes me need a brain break was my favorite, because we do them sometimes. This question is hard. I really appreciated the honesty of that answer. Not sure. Something we're going to learn about. Really liked that one. Knowing when you see something or hear is a fact or fiction, because we have covered genre this year a lot, the difference between fact and fiction within our collection. So I like that they kind of, used some of that language we already have been working with. Being able to tell when something is a lie or a trick. Having questions when you see something that looks fake, like Groundhog's Day. And I do use Groundhog's Day to teach them about, holidays that, why do you think that people believe like the, Groundhog's Day can determine whether spring is coming or it's not. It's a great way to get them to critically think and evaluate how often is this true. Sidebar, but maybe a presentation in the future, right? When you can find ways to see if things are fake, being a library media detective. Love that answer. I also liked, I don't know that, ... yet. Because we're trying to teach them the power of yet in our district, saying, it's okay if you don't know this answer yet. We're going to get you to that point. And if it takes more than a year, then it takes more than a year. If it takes you longer than you're going to have in PK through 12, that is also okay. I'm still learning things. And they often appreciate that. Now, the question a lot of people have asked me, aliens for media literacy? Really, Kristen? And I'm like, absolutely. Why not? I thought back, and I'm like, how am I going to get these students where I'd like them to be based on where they are now? And I thought about an experience I had with Erin Kernan, who was my preceptor at Pine Plains Central School District. She really let me kind of participate in her students' learning. And right away, from day one, I was teaching them, and it was amazing. And I read a book by Meghan McCarthy called Aliens Are Coming. And it was about the H.G. Wells broadcast that panicked people in 1938. And I read this book. The students had amazing points. One of them definitely touched on the fact that COVID was very much a thing. And I was like, you know what? That's another one I'm not touching with a 10-foot pole. And somebody said, I wonder what the broadcast actually sounded like. And I'm like, that's a really good point, right? And then I was like, well, I'm teaching now. I have 3rd and 4th grade. I can plan this lesson. I wonder what it would be like if I framed this around that topic and also pulled in pieces of the actual broadcast for them to listen to, just to assess why people reacted the way they did. So I made this handy dandy choice board. Oh no, some of the pieces are missing. Oh, they're coming up. Thank goodness. Yes, let there be light. So the choice board, they love, not only because we can start the lesson from there. When we're done with the actual introduction, there's other places they can go to. So I'd like to play a little bit of the broadcast for you. What I do with students in the beginning of this lesson, I explain that we're going to listen to a little bit of this, but I preset them for safety. And I say, I just want you to understand, this is something that people were afraid of. It did not actually happen, though. Aliens did not actually come to Grover's Mill, New Jersey in 1938. I promise you, I wouldn't do that to you. The other thing I do is say, if this is something that's getting really overwhelming for you, please feel free to take a step to our break space and just take a moment to decompress. I don't want you to feel like you have to white knuckle it. So I know we're all adults, but if this gets a little bit, feel free to take that space for yourself, take care of yourself, if that makes sense. There's plenty we can do with that. So I have on this choice board the broadcast. They're able to listen to an introduction by the author of Aliens Are Coming that tells them radio was to people in 1938 what television is to us now. It was a form of entertainment. It was a form of news. And my goodness, lost my train of thought there. They're like, oh, well, this is everything was believed very readily on radio broadcast. So on October 31st or October 30th, lost my date there. People heard a broadcast they perceived as real and they reacted accordingly. We all know what happened, but the kids don't, right? Or at least not at that point. The day I meet one who knows, I'm going to be really impressed. So yeah, they listen to it and they're like, their eyes always pop, like listening to the sound effects, listening to the actual language. And then when the alien tentacles and like and the spaceship sounds, they're all like, they're transfixed. I'm like, why can't I get engagement like this all of the time? So usually what I'll also do is stop the broadcast in certain parts and say, is everybody understanding like what's going on? We're still understanding this didn't really happen, right? Like, because every year there are at least one or two students in a class who are starting to think, oh my gosh. And I'm like, it was just a play, don't worry. And that's a perfectly okay thing. So we listen to that. We talk as a group in a circle about what we heard, how they felt about it, and then we kind of tie it to the present. What is different about 2023 last year and 2024 this year that wouldn't have existed? And I'm always really impressed. I mean, I'm going to brag about my students no matter what. I'm always impressed by how many of them immediately say they didn't have internet. And I'm like, okay, tell me more about that. What does internet do for us that enables us to get information quickly? Like, oh, you can go to this website. You can turn on this. Somebody this year actually said, Ms. McClune, do you notice in the book the phone lines being jammed? So even they having the phones, they couldn't go, like if they were getting jammed, how do they call for help? How do they call people in Grover's Mill, New Jersey or near that part of New Jersey to see if something's actually happening? And I'm like, they can't. There's nothing they can do. And then another student whose father is a fire chief said, well, the ambulances and fire trucks got stuck because so many people were trying to leave because they thought it was real. So there was no way to get help, right? I'm telling you, every time I present something like this has to happen. It is the law. Okay, good. So students are making these really great points, and I'm not introducing any of this. They're coming up with this organically on their own. Then a few of them say, oh, well, even if you had a computer, like in the 90s, for instance, do you think this could have happened? I'm like, ooh, tell me more about that. Because not everybody had a handheld phone or a one-to-one device. One of my fourth graders made that point this year and said, if you have a computer that's a desktop and you have to go and actually connect that, what if the internet lines at that point crashed down too because it was so overwhelmed? And I'm like, yes, I love it. So a lot of these really great points were made, students really connecting to the material. And I was like, what have you just learned about media literacy? And we'll get into that in the next slide. But I always set the stage and say, this is how we're going to set the stage. And then we get into this link. It takes them to Pebble Go, which is how they learn more about media literacy, the power of fake news, how they can become those library detectives one of themselves identified as. I also put in the choice board information about the author because they should know who wrote the book. And this book, I had to get 5 copies of it because students wanted to read that book. They're like, well, we heard the broadcast, you read the book to us, but now I want to see it on my own. That book just came back to being on the shelf 2 weeks ago, and I taught the lesson in January. So it drives like so much interest in the extraterrestrial and the unusual and the unknown. And it's actually really brought attention to other aspects of, unsolved mysteries. Bigfoot, what's real and what isn't. How can you tell? What if somebody thinks something is real no matter what you tell them? So they're thinking these things all because I love aliens and had this little idea. Then I always infuse an actual picture of the book to get them a little bit interested. And there's activities within there. where they can create alien Mad Libs to design their own little script for a podcast, which we're hopefully going to do next year. Our innovation coordinator is a very, very busy person. By the time I had this idea, she's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, Kristen, I got too much going on." Next year, though, so they can take the script that was part of the H.G. Wells transcript, practice their use of adjectives and nouns, think about making this outlandish story that people are going to believe, and then we apply that to the use of technology that they're learning anyway. What's most interesting, though, is in the Mad Libs, it's how many kids want to draw the aliens. Like, because there's an activity that teaches you how to draw an alien, like in the book. And I got to tell you, like, they do a really great job. I really should co-teach this with the art teacher. I'm thinking out loud now. All right, so their takeaways, things they learned. So I learned that Wi-Fi can help people find out things quickly. That connection, like that 24-hour news cycle that we have that enables some of us not to panic maybe as easily in 1938. I'm not going to say that's everybody, though, because we actually do talk about how sometimes there's still phenomenon where people believe something is happening that certainly isn't. That people really believed everything they heard on the radio, and that I like listening to stories. This student, they've grown so much in the last year. It was my student who wasn't checking out anything. And then they started checking out those alien books. And then they started using Sora. And then they said, okay, well, what else have you got? Because I've already read all this stuff. And I'm like, well, your public library has this. And, I have this on Epic. And there's quizzes that you can take to demonstrate your learning. And I can't tell you how much pride, they strut into library now, like, hey, what's going on? And I'm like, this is great. When people panic, it can make it hard to get help or to get answers. And I thought that was a really important point that they came to on their own. The person who answered that said, well, they all reacted in such a way that help couldn't get to them. And sometimes when you're really scared, no matter what you see coming or what you hear, you're caught up, was how they put it. I'm like, that is very true. How did Orson Welles feel when he found out he scared people? That was a question that they asked on their own, because this was something they put on a reflection ticket, and I encouraged them to give me an idea. They thought, give me a question. And that actually is covered in Aliens Are Coming by Meghan McCarthy. There were sounds on radio shows. That was something that shocked a lot of people, the special effects that were still available in 1938. One student was like, all of this was so new. Movies, radio. Do you think that's why people freaked out the way they did? And they used the word freaked out, not me. And I'm like, tell me more about that. And they're like, well, if something feels new and they're doing such a good job of making it seem like they're there, why wouldn't you panic? I'm like, A+. All right. So it scared me a little. And I think it really scared people in 1938. I just figured that was a really good thing to touch on after we just talked about the feelings. I didn't know phones were so different in 1938 and that lines could get jammed. And they actually asked a question, does that happen now? And I said, well, I remember when I was a little bit older than you, September 11th happened. And I had family coming in from overseas that day. And not only were we not able to get a hold of them because they were on a plane, even when they were on the ground, they were fine. International calling. And then even making a domestic call in certain areas was really impossible. So they said, wow, so what else has happened in the 21st century that's kind of like that? I'm like, oh, good. When we get to the more of the lessons, that's something you can research on your own for extra credit. I do offer extra credit. Why do people still think fake things are real if we can use technology? And I'm like, that's a question I wish I had an answer for you on. And it's a good one. Tell me more about what you're thinking. And some of them said, well, sometimes when you believe something and it's part of what you think is true, it's really hard to not hear something that's, to hear something that's going to tell you it's not. And I'm like, man, you all, I have such hope for this generation based on these answers because they're amazing. Don't believe everything you hear or read because sometimes it's pretend. Why did so many grown-ups believe it? And we kind of covered that. It's easier to find out about fake hoaxes. Also, there was no internet in 1938. And then my favorite questions of all time are aliens real? This is the most common one. And I'm like, That's another one. Cover that. I'll give you some library extra credit if you turn that into a big idea research project. Were you there? And I listed that one because it's my favorite question I have ever been asked by a student. This is a fourth grader who just made me feel so accepted right away. And she raised her hand and she had that light in her eyes, like she had the greatest idea. And I'm like, what can I do for you? She's like, Ms. McClune, were you there? And I laughed and like that sparkle dulled. So I'm like, oh, I gotta clean it down a little bit, but I gotta explain myself. I'm like, the way you asked that question made me feel so appreciated. No, I wasn't there. And she said, well, you seem like you know so much about it. It felt like you were really there. And I'm like, this is the greatest moment of my life so far. And it really, truly was. So, quick breakdown of my takeaways: tap into student interest to engage them in media literacy, because there's a lot you could teach them. But if you're tapping into that interest in the supernatural and aliens, they might be more receptive to hearing it. Rely on student input. Knowing that some of them were really freaked out and scared helped me to cultivate that safety preset. Multiple literacies can help build media literacy skills. Hearing that broadcast, I think, did more to help them understand why that broadcast is so powerful rather than me just telling them about it, if that makes sense. And then to close, I just want to say thank you to my greatest teachers. These are my third and fourth graders. They are part of why we do what we do. I'm so proud to teach them, and they make it all possible. So far, they've been the people who've given me the most to work on and reflect on so that we can have fun and learn together. Now I'm going to break my own rule. I never generally ask any questions, but the Bitmoji did not have what questions do you have, which is what I like to ask. What questions might you have? Anybody? Sorry if that came off like I had like too much espresso, but I just got so excited. Well, I certainly am contactable. I can put my email out somehow. If you have questions, feel free to use anything you see today. And thank you all for having me.